Thank you everyone for joining us today to discuss the very important topic of fusion energy. I'm Alicia Virone, the Government Affairs Director at CATF, and I will be moderating the webinar today. We will record the event and we will then make it available online for people to watch it later on. So the discussion today is extremely timely. As you've seen, the European Commission just opened its consultation for the fusion energy strategy. And so the goal of this event will be to discuss a fusion energy industrial strategy, what it should look like to make sure that the technology can be developed and deployed in Europe on time, and what kind of measures are needed to make sure that the fusion energy can meet its potential in Europe and beyond. Fusion energy has seen a renewed interest these last couple of years in the new geopolitical and energetic context, as the EU is facing a triple challenge of having to decarbonize its economy, trying to find a new way to ensure energy security, and also meeting the growing energy demand. And on these 3 points, fusion energy can provide great opportunities. We've also seen rapid advancement and progress in fusion energy technology in Europe, but also globally, that make us closer than ever for fusion energy to realize its potential and to go from theory to reality. The EU has for very long been leading on the fusion energy. However, we've seen that other parts of the world have been catching up very fast and have been better these last years to move from theory and experiments to commercialization. And so if the EU wants to make sure that they remain in the lead for fusion energy, they will need to adopt an ambitious and effective fusion strategy. And that is what we will be discussing today, what kind of measures are needed. One of the key factors that the EU will need to consider is how to move from experimentation to commercialization. So the EU will need to move outside of the laboratory and ensure the European fusion ecosystem modernize and evolve to reflect the progress of the global private fusion energy industry. Only then will Europe be able to meet the goal of the fusion energy and ensure that we are succeeding in the race towards this technology. The EU has the potential, we have the experience, the people, the knowledge, the institution, but we're still lacking the right enabling tool, the right industrial framework and clear investment signal to make sure that innovation is moving into scalable and commercial fusion energy solution. Today we're going to discuss what we can do to change that and how we can develop a forward-looking EU fusion strategy. The webinar will be divided in 2 parts. The first one will be a presentation of CATF report that has been launched today called A Fusion Engine for Growth, Making Fusion Energy Drive European Competitiveness. And it includes a SWOT analysis of the current EU fusion ecosystem, alongside with a set of very clear recommendations on what the EU fusion energy strategy should look like. The second part of the workshop will be a panel discussion with different people from the fusion energy industry ecosystem, discussing the different recommendations and what, in their opinion, is needed to move forward. I'm encouraging everyone to participate actively and to drop your question into the chat. And I'm not going to delay the meat of the discussion further, and I would like to introduce our panelists as part of our CATF Fusion team, Sheila Gonzalez, the Global Director for Fusion Energy, and Jack Moore, CATF Policy Consultant.
Thank you very much, Alessia. Thank you very much for your introduction. As have been mentioned, we are going to go through a description of what you can find in that report, and also important, what you cannot find in that document. This is a work that we have been doing during the last year and a half. It has been based on our experience, what we have learned in that period, and also a lot of feedback provided by many of the main stakeholders that we highly appreciated. We have collected all the information, analyzed it, and make an analysis and propose a number of recommendations that we think can help to Europe to take the leadership and to push for a fusion industrial sector. So please, next one. So the first thing that we want to explain is the purpose of the report. This is the first time that a proper European fusion strategy is presented. And this report provides policy and governance recommendations to secure fusion commercial potential in Europe. This is not a technical roadmap. I want to highlight that thing. This is not a technical roadmap where you highlight or name the devices, machines that you need to achieve certain goals, and you put together a scientific technical program. It's something at higher level than that. It's a strategy, and a roadmap should be derived from that strategy. So we acknowledge and we have analyzed that the fusion landscape has shifted significantly since the last roadmap, since the last European roadmap. New players are in the game, and new strategies should reflect this progress. We have new players, we have new timelines, and honestly, we have new push toward this commercialization. That all these elements needs to be integrated, analyze it, and a new document should be issued, and this is the purpose of this document. What we have acknowledged in that document is the European fusion ecosystem has real strength and deep expertise. And all this strength, this expertise, these facilities, this know-how has to be translated in creating an industrial sector, a commercial approach for fusion. This is what is not existing now, maybe because we don't have this private sector push or for whatever other reasons, but now this is how fusion is evolving, and Europe needs to be able to catch up and lead this deployment of this new source of energy. Fusion can be a clean, secure energy source powering Europe as an engine of growth, if supported by the right industrial framework and policies. And this is what this report is focusing, these right industrial frameworks and policies. This is something that Europe has not been able to discuss and to implement in the last years, and we need to catch up on that to be able to keep leading the fusion deployment. Next one, please. We have been reading carefully the report issued by Mr. Draghi, where fusion can be a case study of that report perfectly well, because it fits into all the characteristics of some technology that can push for productivity growth, that can put Europe at the edge of innovation, but for whatever reason we are falling behind. So in the Draghi report, we have 3 key actions to drive productivity growth: translating innovation into commercialization, decarbonization as a growth opportunity, and increasing security by reducing dependencies. Whatever person who has been working on fusion knows that fusion needs to translate this innovation into commercialization, and we have this innovation in Europe. We are failing in the translation to the commercialization part. Fusion is an energy net zero emission. It's a firm and dense energy profile that could support both energy transition and energy addition, and ensure reliable and affordable low carbon electricity. So it matches completely with this of the actions, and increase security by reducing dependencies. Fusion fuel is abundant. We have, thanks to it, established a relatively strong supply chain in Europe, and could help to drive Europe to energy independence. So it's a match 1-to-1 to the 3 key actions of the Mr. Draghi's report, and it's something that we analyze again through the whole document. Next one, please. We have seen how the fusion energy commercialization trends has been evolving over the last 8 years. We have now at least $8,000 million committed in fusion. Today, we have a great announcement by our colleagues from Proxima that they have received new funding, and this is a reason to be happy, because the more resources in fusion will benefit the whole community and the citizens. We have Esther here who will talk about, and she will mention for sure. We have enabling technologies and technologies that were not available 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and now make fusion more real, more possible. These new materials, artificial intelligence and high performance computing tools, advanced manufacturing, all these are making fusion, I wouldn't say easier, but more accessible. And a drastic change in the commercial timelines. We are now, the timing that the companies are talking about is about demonstration plans by the late of the 20s of these decades, having some pilot plans by the early 30s and going to the commercial expansion in the late 30s, 40s. So that the timelines has been reduced. The approach now is to have more modular machines, the smaller machines, faster to build, cheaper to build. We have these new enabling technologies, the high temperature superconductor, that are making that promise something more possible. Why Europe is falling behind in this new ecosystem? First of all, because the vast majority of the European fusion investment has gone outside of Europe. We are not able to attract this private capital. Draghi report recommends cultivating industry, which A, has an impact strategy action areas, and B, where Europe has inherent advantage enabling to compete, and fusion falls into these two categories. We have this advantage, we have the expertise, we have facilities, which are unique in the world, and fusion is one of these strategic actions that we need to develop in Europe to have energy security and abundance. So what this report is trying to answer is this fundamental question of, can Europe compete in the global fusion energy market? And if so, how? Which are our strengths? Which are our weaknesses? And for that, my colleague Jack will go through the content of the report, starting from a SWOT analysis where we analyze all these aspects, and then based on that, making recommendations how we can really push fusion to commercialization in Europe by the European entrepreneurs. So please, Jack.
Thanks, Sahila. Yeah, can we go to the next slide, please? So I'll start with the obvious. Yes, you do hear an American accent talking about European fusion policy, but I promise I started my career at ITER and spent my years studying in France. So I think of myself as part of this ecosystem. So we can continue from there. So it's clear that fusion energy can contribute to the three pillars of growth that Draghi identifies as necessary to close the innovation gap in Europe. So then the question becomes that second condition. Is there the innovative edge in Europe to make fusion a realistic arena to compete in on the global stage to drive productivity growth? And if so, Europe must, because that opportunity is so large, we can't ignore ways to close that gap. And so we took that question at face value and conducted a SWOT analysis of the European fusion ecosystem and its readiness for commercialization. And what we found is, yes, the innovative edge is there because of the infrastructural strengths of the European fusion ecosystem. I can't emphasize enough the importance of the ITER project being sited in Europe and being the host, the host nation or whatever you want to call it. The supply chain that has emerged as a result of that is second to none. Fusion component manufacturing became profitable in Europe far earlier than anywhere else because of the outsized responsibilities of Europe for procurement for the ITER project, which has resulted in a relatively mature supply chain ready to serve both a European commercial fusion ecosystem as well as a global one. The R&D infrastructure in Europe is second to none. The test beds across the continent are advancing the frontiers of fusion energy science as the backbone for a commercial industry to be built off of. This strength has to be leveraged as much as possible to support commercial fusion companies be really the tip of the spear for innovation-based growth. And we see those existing private fusion energy startups across Europe. They constitute a group of credible approaches towards putting commercial fusion energy on the grid, and their diversity of concepts increases the likelihood that one of them or more will succeed in economical commercial fusion energy. The talent across the continent in Europe in fusion is immense. There's flagship research universities across the continent which are training young fusion professionals. There's the availability of research funding for students to be able to pursue their interests in fusion research. And the facilities across Europe provide a really unique breeding ground for a fusion workforce. So for example, ITER provides a really unique experience to work somewhere where you're participating in all the way from design to decommissioning. And the majority of the ITER staff is European. And that goes for test beds and facilities across Europe, not just tokamaks, but for example, W7X for stellarators and many more test beds. And finally, the Fusion for Energy joint undertaking is a real strength of the European ecosystem. So EFRI was established as the domestic agency for the ITER project as agreed upon in the ITER Treaty. But it's more sophisticated than its counterparts because of Europe's outsized responsibilities for ITER as the project host. So that's allowed it to have an expanded mandate, which was expanded in 2012 to prepare the fusion ecosystem in Europe to support the construction of pilot plants towards commercialization. And its status as a joint undertaking gives it a unique legal persona, which allows it a bit of a flexibility and mission to take on the responsibility of moving from research to development to commercialization in a rapid manner that can be executed quickly. It's interesting. There's many other industries that have pushed for a joint undertaking to be created on their behalf. It already exists in fusion, so we really need to make sure we leverage it as much as we can. In addition, EFRI's extensive linkages to industry through its industrial liaison officer network and its history of procurement for the ITER project really create a connection with industry to be able to drive forward a unified vision of putting fusion energy on the grid. Weaknesses, on the other hand, are largely not infrastructural, but process-based, which is good because it means that they can be fixed. And that's not a judgment to say that the policy and governance structures in Europe were poorly designed. They were just designed largely for an era in which commercial fusion energy seemed a long ways off. And as we've seen, since the last roadmap was published, a lot has happened in the fusion energy industry to make commercial fusion realistic in a shorter to medium time frame. So for example, the overlapping competing governance structures that we talk about in Europe in the report between Eurofusion and Fusion for Energy, that was something that made sense when we had a really scientific-based mission for a long-term push towards commercial fusion energy, because you could divvy those things up. But when you're thinking about putting actual pilot plants on the grid, it's really hard to separate the science and the building process. So that creates a bit of a muddled authority and makes it difficult to drive a unified vision towards putting commercial fusion energy on the grid as soon as possible. And I should mention that that's something that we share across the industry, whatever organization we come from, because it's just a matter of getting all on the same page of how we get there. But the science, the industry, we all want to put fusion energy on the grid. The same goes for the Eurofusion roadmap. That was designed to have ITER hand off to a public sector pilot plant demo to then hand off to the commercial industry in the second half of the century. That made sense when it didn't seem like commercial fusion was a very viable endeavor, but the advancements that Sahila talked about makes commercial fusion more realistic in the short term. And we need to make sure that R&D infrastructure across Europe is able to directly support not just a demo design, but private sector fusion startups that are looking in the near term to put to pursue commercial pilot plant projects. A lack of regulatory certainty is a byproduct of an industry that seemed a long ways off. You don't want to put in a regulatory system too early to box in innovation. But as we get closer to putting commercial fusion energy on the grid in Europe, the regulatory certainty does need to be there for to de-risk investments to make sure that there won't be an overly burdensome regulatory regime that's pro-innovation. And then finally, knowledge management. That's not a European-specific weakness, but because of the strong R&D infrastructure, it is essential that none of the knowledge that's been invested in slips through the cracks. Now, the one thing I didn't mention is that low level of private sector investment. And I know that's somewhat getting fixed. I know Esther from Proxima later on might talk about their success on that just this morning. But this is a structural issue where there are less deep capital markets across Europe that makes it harder to finance innovation. There's less risk appetite in the investment market. And so how do we overcome that? And that's where public-private partnerships come in. I know we've talked about that in many different workshops, and that's the buzzword in European fusion right now. But that's why it's so important to provide a public anchor to drive funds towards de-risking private sector investment to overcome this structural issue. There's many tools that have been proposed in the Draghi report and others about how we can fix this gap. But for a little bit, fusion is going to need to work within this context and find ways to overcome that structural barrier. And that's through emphasizing its strengths and using public-private partnerships to mitigate that weakness. So can we go to the next slide? So these are kind of our recommendations for how to enhance our strengths and to overcome the weaknesses in the European fusion ecosystem. Next slide. So that begins with a key enabling technology-based roadmap. And that's moving away from this ITER to demo to then commercialization model, because according to that model, the applied R&D, not the foundational science R&D, but the applied R&D is going towards closing the gaps for the demo design. And we want to make sure that we don't have a national champion that stifles competition from the private sector. So we want to make sure that all fusion actors in Europe have access to the world-class R&D going on in Europe. So we want to have a bottom-up approach where industry is involved in defining what are the key enabling technology gaps that remain, and how can we make sure that the public sector drives forward a mission that helps private fusion get on the grid as soon as possible, because the private fusion energy wins are Europe's wins in driving productivity growth. And at the more granular level, that means retrofitting existing facilities to meet these goals. So that means, for example, utilizing ITER for knowledge and technology transfer. That's already begun through the private sector fusion engagement program that's been happening there, and the once-a-year workshops that they've been holding. If that can be expanded, ITER can be even more of a resource for the private sector. Second of all, experimental prioritization at existing operating facilities to make sure that private sector fusion actors have access to these world-class capabilities. So, for example, at IFMIF Dunnes, there's going to be a world-class prototypic neutron source to mimic the neutron irradiation environment inside of future commercial fusion machines. How can we make sure that private sector companies are able to test the materials that they will need to verify their design? And there's many more examples like that we talk about in the report. Next slide, please. So our really core recommendation for the reorganization of the European fusion ecosystem is to establish Fusion for Energy as the unified European fusion governance body as sort of a central node for the whole European ecosystem. So this would designate Fusion for Energy to coordinate financing. So instead of having sort of an arbitrary split between Eurofusion and Fusion for Energy financing and then have them disperse their own funds, it would put all the eggs in sort of one basket to be able to fund a unified vision according to stakeholders and where we can move towards commercialization through public sector action. Implementing that KET-based roadmap. We'll talk a little bit about public-private partnership leadership through FRE, and then managing workforce development, supply chain integration, as they largely already do. Now, why do we choose Fusion for Energy? I don't want to go through the strengths again because we've already talked about it, but the linkages to industry and their ability to incorporate private sector needs into their actions makes it a really attractive mechanism to drive public sector action towards commercialization, especially its status as a joint undertaking. Whereas Eurofusion is a really scientific oriented endeavor meant to split up funding along basic science initiatives. And a recent Euratom review stated that Eurofusion has delivered well on its scientific research mission, but is not fit to achieve commercial exploitation of fusion energy. And so that's where it's really hard to incorporate private sector voices into the Eurofusion roadmap that really drives directly toward a demo design and not including private sector actors working concurrently. So could we go to the next slide? So this is sort of a visualization of where we see FRE at the center of the European fusion ecosystem. You can kind of see how it can serve as this central node, and through it connecting different aspects of the ecosystem, all driving towards a unified vision. Continue, please. So there's been a lot of talk about establishing a PPP program in Europe. We've had multiple really good ideas, but we're not endorsing or discounting any of them. What we are saying is that a structural weakness of Europe is the lack of availability of investment. And that means that as soon as possible to compete with international competitors, a PPP program has to be running. And we know that FRE can do that because it already is through its technology development program. That's a pilot program. And within its mandate, it's possible to run a public-private partnership program that we can launch as soon as possible. And that's something that needs to happen today for fusion actors in the supply chain and developers to be able to have access to public money as an anchor to drive forward their mission towards commercialization. So we believe that that through repurposing available funds before future funding windows, we could get to a program that is somewhere along the same size as the milestone-based fusion development program in the United States. And a key element along with that is establishing attractive IP rights for industry along these programs. This shouldn't be a negotiation where each side is trying to extract value. We understand that Europe needs to find opportunities to close the productivity gap. And in doing so, European private fusion industry wins are a win for Europe as a whole. Next slide, please. So one of the strengths that we've talked about is the European fusion supply chain, and that allows fusion to contribute to energy security. The Draghi report really recommends that supply chain stewardship happens in essential sectors to make sure that supply chains stay strong and friendly, that we already have F4E as in its linkages with the supply chain gives us unique advantages to be able to do that in fusion without having to create a new entity. But it is important that in the context of new threats with changing geopolitical risks and different relationships with Europe's partners, that there's continued comprehensive mapping of the supply chain, and we're not over relying on single suppliers, even if we may have thought that in the past that single supplier was rock solid. We want to make sure that that the European fusion supply chain stays secure as it projects to be today. And we want to make sure that F4E is empowered to respond to those supply chain risks as its mandate should allow it, based on its linkages with the supply chain through its relationship with ITER and its expanded responsibilities to prepare the European fusion industry. You know, the next slide. So regulating radiation is a member state responsibility in Europe, and that's not something that we want to impede because there's already good work going on in many European states. But if we're going to have pan-European fusion energy champions emerge that have massive market caps that are able to drive growth in Europe, we need to make sure that they can operate across the continent. And that means aligning regulatory principles, even if regulatory regimes may not be exactly the same. So at the European level, we recommend that the Council Directive 2013-59 Euratom, which is the basic safety standards, establishes a regulatory principle, including fusion energy under that directive, which would separate it from fission energy regulations to make sure that regulations in Europe are not overly burdensome for the scale up of fusion energy and are appropriate for its risk profile. Next slide. And then finally, this is sort of a broad recommendation, but you saw on the opportunity slide that Europe's climate action initiatives are a real opportunity if fusion can be included in them more often. Fusion has been for a long time considered an energy of the future, but we see that it's coming closer and closer to reality, and it can contribute to Europe's climate change mission. So the tools that have been laid out in the Draghi report and the competitiveness compass and across European legislation should make sure that they explicitly include fusion wherever possible to use those tools to drive fusion forward as an opportunity for decarbonization, increasing energy security, and importantly, closing that innovation gap. So explicitly including fusion in the EU Green Taxonomy, explicitly adding it as a strategic net zero technology under the NZIA. Even though these are things that we interpret as fusion being eligible for already, we want to make sure that there's no question about it. And then just for European policymakers to have in the back of their mind fusion energy as they're thinking about what are tools to drive forward the energy transition and energy addition, and how can we make sure that fusion is eligible for it. Next slide. So that's a quick summary of our recommendations for the report. We encourage you to read the report on our website. And now I'm going to hand it over to the panel for the second half of this event.
Thank you. So I would like to introduce the panelists for the second half of this webinar. The first one is Mariana Ginola, board member of the European Fusion Association and head of nuclear fusion energy and research at CEMIC, Esther Cantor, head of international policy at Proxima Fusion, and Sheila Gonzalez, global director at CETF Fusion Program. And I will start with you, Sheila. One of the recommendations of the report is really to put fusion for energy at the heart of the governance in the EU for fusion. Can you tell us a bit more about how and why you and your team came to that conclusion?
Well, that was something that we found when we were analyzing what for us would be the ideal way to structure fusion. The first thing that we wanted to do is to strengthen coordination. And at the same level, the other thing that it was important for us was to include the role of the private sector. So far, the private sector has not had a voice in deciding the roadmap, which are the main facilities that we need, which are their main needs, in particular towards commercialization. So we want to find a way how to include this private sector in discussions and give them a chair in the room to be able to push for their needs. So we wanted to also to avoid fragmentation. Coordination is very important. Fragmentation is also important. We wanted to keep this spirit of Europe having an European program on fusion. That is something that we have and we want to maintain. So how to get access to all the facilities, how to work together to get the best results, how to exchange knowledge among different countries in Europe. We also wanted to include all the successful histories that we have in Europe, like the border approach, which is our excellent collaboration with Japan, where there are a number of achievements in technology, in plasma science, GT60, all the demo design program, the material research program, high computing centers. So all this knowledge and facilities to perform experiments has to be coordinated from somewhere. And how the priorities are set up, which are how to handle the access to those facilities, has to be handled by someone. And when we were through the different institutions, we found that there was, first of all, an European agency for fusion, and this is F4E. The scope of fusion for energy is not only ITER, it's not only the procurement for ITER, it's also demo and IFMIF donors. So basically we were having that, what we were looking for. So the idea to say, okay, let's take advantage of what we have. This is an existing agency. It's a quite complex scope. The only thing that we will need to do is to tune it, enlarge it a little bit, but we use an existing agency. This is how we end up in saying fusion for an enlarged fusion for energy will be the element to coordinate, to push for fusion towards commercialization in Europe. Said that, also a very important aspect of fusion for energy is all the experience in handling contracts, all the procurements for it, being in contact with the supply chain, with the industry. So this expertise and know-how, lesson learned, but experience with experience is also a key element for us to say we need to follow that way.
Thank you. So first, a quick reminder for all the attendees to please put your question into the Q&A box. We will take them at the end. I know we're running a little bit late, so let's try to stick to the time for the answer. And the next question is for you, Esther. So as you know, the report focuses a lot on how the commercial deployment of fusion energy could drive European productivity and growth, and you represent one of the company which could drive that growth. So could you tell us a little bit more about how successful commercial fusion deployment could close the innovation gap, leverage decarbonization for growth, and increase energy security? So basically all what the Draghi report called pillars of growth.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Talasia, for the question. I'll try to keep to my assigned time slot. It's a very complex issue, right? And I want to start with the great news that you have already suggested it earlier. So Proxima Fusion, we are a Munich-based energy company, and we have just closed our Series A fundraising with an amazing result of 130 million euros raised from investors. This is the highest amount that European fusion companies have raised. So we are very happy about this, elated. It means the trust, it acknowledges the progress that has been made by our company. Our mission is to bring fusion energy to the grid. We are designing and building stellarators. So this is a tremendous acknowledgement of the progress that we have made in the last 2 years. So this also kind of can be used as an example of closing the innovation gap, right? So Proxima Fusion is a great example for this because it validates somehow the decades of scientific investment that Europe has made into fusion research. Proxima Fusion founders are all nuclear physicists. We are using European talent. We are a European company, truly. And using and capitalizing on past investments and turning them into scalable technologies that can be put onto the market, and making Europe a supplier of a critical technology and not a buyer is crucial. It's crucial for productivity. It's crucial for growth. Fusion is green technology. It can replace fossil fuels. It can provide clean energy into the grid upon which you can inject renewables. So every country can decide on the energy mix that they use. It will truly revolutionize energy and energy systems as we know it. It will create strategic independence for energy. And this is something that Europe has been looking for quite a while. It also creates independence from volatile markets on electricity and energy and even rare earth materials. So this is a strategic sector for Europe in terms of growth, in terms of potential. And I think the focus needs to be on working together with the private sector to design the instruments that can best facilitate this growth and can move the entire industry into the next stage to make those requirements that we've seen in the Draghi report that would truly make Europe competitive. So that is, I think, what the message is here from the private sector.
Thank you very much. And to build on what you'd just say, one of the recommendations of the report is to make sure that the private industry is involved in the policy development and implementation process. But there is not one private industry. It is a disparate group and not a monolith. And so, Mariana, can you tell us a bit more about what is the importance of industry group like EFA to bring these different perspectives together into a unified voice to be able to communicate the demand and the suggestion from the public sector, from the private sector to the public one?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. So we have seen in the recent times that fusion is living an important moment of growth, and we see a series of new startups and initiatives coming up, as we have discussed in US, in East Asia, in EU. However, instruments and investments in private sector is concentrated mainly in North America and in East Asia rather than in Europe. This new environment of change, however, stimulated the industry to come together. And in fact, EFA is formed by leading European companies from across the entire value chain. And our goal is to provide a platform to unify the European interests. In this context, the global fusion industry requires an entire ecosystem working together. It's a big challenge, and we can help to push forward and to help a European industrial renaissance. So industry for sure is a key player, an important actor, and we are collaborating both with public and private entities supporting the projects to move on and to be real. So this is why at EFA we are actively engaging with policymakers and decision makers to try to drive action towards fusion. We are collaborating today with all the main stakeholders, including, of course, the European Commission, but also working closely with F4E, with ITER, with the EIA. And it is very important that EU works to avoid falling behind, as we have seen on the global fusion maps. And today, the efforts of EFA and of the industry that is part of EFA are all in this direction. So, in our opinion, listening to the voice of industry that now is coming together is essential to bring an approach that can be a bit more pragmatic and to bring a bit of this action into the European strategy. So it is very important that industry is part of this strategy because it's one of the main players. At EFA, we are today more than 50 members. The association was founded in Brussels in November 2024. And after about 8 months of work, we can proudly say that we are more than 50 from representing 11 countries and different competencies and covering the entire supply chain. And today we are really working hard together to be a unified voice for Europe, supporting the institutions and the stakeholders with our point of view, with the aim to make fusion a reality. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Then I have my next question for you again, Sheila. So before you came to CETF, you spent years working in the European public sector. And as such, you are very familiar with the research and development capability of Europe Fusion testbed. And so my question for you is, why is that a key strength of Europe fusion's ecosystem, and how can it be maximized to benefit Europe's commercial competitiveness?
Well, indeed, all the facilities and expertise, not only the facility, the people, the knowledge counts. Existing in Europe is our biggest strength. That has been developed over the years, partially thanks to ITER, that have been pushing all this R&D that have been done over years, and other big experiments. And the demo project also pushed to find solutions for diverters, for blankets. So all this is something that we need to leverage. We need to change the approach and to make available all this expertise and these facilities to a new player, which is the private sector. How can we integrate these facilities, this expertise into a fusion ecosystem where the private sector can, I wouldn't say benefit because it sounds like if you are taking advantage, but can be part of that, can be part of the facility running in a particular lab. We have in Europe unique facilities like the Tritium Lab in KIT, IFMIF Don is being built in Granada. I don't want to mention too many because otherwise someone will be offended that I didn't mention, but these are really flagships facilities. So how to integrate that in an open fusion ecosystem where the private sector has a voice and has a role and have access to that facilities and that expertise. And then you have competition and a competitive private sector that end up in having a fusion industry done in Europe and for the rest of the mankind, because it will be a global market where Europe can compete.
Thanks a lot. Esther, the next question is for you, and it's about regulation, which is obviously an important factor to support commercialization. In your view, what kind of clarity, what kind of regulation are needed from the EU level for companies to have the certainty they need to move forward towards commercial deployment?
Yes. So I think here I would just like to make a quick clarification. When we are talking about regulation, we're not talking about European-wide regulation with a capital R. So we are not looking for a regulation or a directive at the European level. Rather, we are seeking harmonization, a coordination of member state approaches. Now, this can come in a variety in different forms. As you have mentioned earlier in the presentation, that there are some member states who are more ahead than others. So I think there needs to be a framework within that can inform policymakers, a code of practice for national regulators, something to that effect. And I think the key elements that are important in this framework are, as you have mentioned earlier, making sure that there's a clear distinction between fusion and fission. So fusion has a very different risk profile than fission. Regulating them under the same framework would stifle innovation, would actually reduce growth and competitiveness in the sector and across Europe. I think it is important to point out that it is great that a European fusion strategy is coming up. We definitely have seen the open public consultation call and will be contributing to that. But it's also important to point out that it's somewhat belated. So other countries, the United States, the UK, have done this already. And it is very important that Europe designs a fusion strategy that is benefiting the private sector, accelerating the growth, because as I mentioned earlier, it helps close the innovation gap, helps validate the decades of public investment into scientific research. So basically, the European Commission needs to do it fast and needs to do it well, so no pressure. But I think it's important to note that for example, Proxima Fusion is launching the first fusion demonstrator in 2031. The US and China are planning theirs in 2027. And partially fueled by rapid investment from private investors and also public de-risking mechanisms. And I think this is where Europe could do more as well to make sure that private investment flows into the sector, accelerates growth, is to provide those regulatory frameworks that are necessary for private investors to feel secure that in the knowledge that the public sector supports this industry. Also, to send a clear signal that there is clarity between fusion and fission, that there is a support and a willingness to harmonize member state approaches. So that can help capitalize on those past investments.
Thanks a lot. The next question is for you, Mariana. So you're here today representing not only EAFE, but also CIMIC as head of the Nuclear and Fusion Energy Research Department. In our report, we stress that the ITER project has been a strength of European fusion ecosystem, especially in building a supply chain that CIMIC is a key part of. Could you explain from your point of view how ITER made fusion manufacturing a profitable industry in Europe, and how the European fusion energy supply chain is positioned to meet a growing commercial sector, both globally and in Europe? Could supply chain growth also contribute to European productivity growth?
Thank you for the question. So, yes, first of all, the European supply chain is strong in general and very diversified, thanks, in fact, to a deep experience in various fields, including surely fusion. So we have all the skills and the expertise. And this is also thanks to the fact that many companies like us have worked for long on the ITER project. ITER is still today, has been and is still today, a primary reference point in Europe for sure. In fact, the ITER project was a powerful driver of innovation and growth for companies like CIMIC, for example. In fact, this gave us the possibility to innovate, to invest, to grow, with a very important contribution to the European productivity and competitiveness. The case of CIMIC, I think it's quite emblematic, because we have been collaborating with fusion and in particular with the ITER project since about 20 years, 15 and 20 years. And we manufactured many different parts for the machine and supplied services as well, produced complex components with very tight requirements, high technology, demanding in terms of quality. And to be successful in this project and in the several jobs that we carried out, we had to innovate, to make R&D as well, and to invest in resources and infrastructures and facilities, like us, many other companies have done. And now Europe has, in my opinion, to capitalize from this. We have to use this heritage and go further. So the European supply chain, including CIMIC, is today a world reference point. We are, as companies like CIMIC, we are supporting also the US private sector, for example. We are producing many complex components for CFS or for other American customers and private companies. So industry now can act in synergy and be part of this change, as we are trying to do in EFA. And to try to put all this together, in fact, we are working also in EFA on several working groups, supply chain, technology growth, that are 3 main working groups, with the idea to put together the experiences of many companies like us in the ITER project and in the other experiences, and to provide, in fact, support also for EU decision makers. So the industry is present and ready, mainly thanks here in Europe to the ITER project. But we need now to be involved in new projects. We need to look ahead and support also the private projects that we see. And as a company, we are doing so. So we need to continue working in fusion as we have done in the last 15, 20 years for ITER. So ITER is a great heritage, is a great driver of innovation, and it has prepared a great ground for the companies here in Europe. But now we need, in fact, to have more projects. We need to support the private industry and also to be able to reinforce our competitiveness and go forward. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that answer. As a last topic to address before we move towards the question from the audience, I would like to discuss public-private partnership with both Esther and Mariana. This is a topic that always comes back when we're discussing fusion, and the Commission has recognized that a fusion-specific PPP would be needed to drive commercial progress in fusion energy. So maybe starting with you, Esther, what would you be looking for in a PPP instrument?
Again, I think I just want to add a bit of clarification. So not necessarily to you, but just in general, when we are talking about PPPs, we are not just talking about one grant mechanism or a financing instrument. We're talking about a governance structure, right? A mode of thinking when collaborating, when driving innovation, and when scaling up technologies, how the public and private sector should work together. For companies like Proxima Fusion, it's about de-risking investment, helping to scale up and deploy. So it's a partnership in its true form at scale. So we have to also look at what the financing volume behind a PPP is so that it can effectively and truly support scale up. Whether we are talking about demonstrators, which I may have mentioned we are going to launch in 2031, but also when we're talking about full-scale power plants, right? So that we will be bringing to the grid. It is truly important. There are several different projects around the world, so there's no one-size-fits-all solution. We can look at milestone-based programs or the Infuse program from the United States, where you can provide temporary exchanges to different facilities, whether it's private or public, or you can have, even in the European Union, you have, of course, the joint undertaking, right? So in this case, you have mentioned Fusion for Energy before, but Fusion for Energy is a little bit different than the regular joint undertaking, right? So because it doesn't have yet the private sector involvement in its board that is necessary. So there could be also a consideration of whether to go down that route as well. So these are important discussions to be had, and in the decisions to have the right kind of mechanism, it is also very important to have the private sector a seat at the table. There is, for example, the Fusion Expert Group, which had been releasing its opinion paper, and those the members of the Fusion Expert Group are member state representatives. It would be important to have a seat for the private sector at the table of these consultation bodies, of these roundtable discussions. I feel we need to go beyond, a step beyond these open public consultations and have more direct exchanges between public and private bodies, because at the end of the day, it will increase confidence. It will increase clarity, both for the regulators, as for the public, as for the private sector stakeholders and the entire supply chain. So that is the role of public-private partnerships. And in the case of like fusion technologies, it has to be a long time scale that can effectively support the projects throughout their time span, not only focusing on TRLs, but effective demonstration projects. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Mariana, last question before we take question from the audience. On PPP2, how can they be used strategically to prepare the supply chain to support a mature European fusion industry?
Yeah, so I think PPPs can be an important instrument, in fact, to accelerate the deployment of fusion. We have seen that in Europe, unfortunately, at the moment, there is not yet a defined PPP program. For example, we discussed the differences with the US running much faster, and this is also probably thanks to the milestone-based program that has been done in the US, which is probably also partially responsible of the rapid growth in the private sector, being able to attract private investments and efforts towards fusion. So this is for sure something that we have to be able to do in Europe. The lack of a specific PPP program, of course, will slow down further the activities and the deployment of fusion. So I think that, as Esther said, it has to be a clear and comprehensive tool, also addressing for sure how funding could be helped, because in absence of a dedicated program in Europe, private companies that maybe are willing to invest, or industry maybe that also as a private entity is willing to contribute, let's say, to investments in fusion, is basically left to look for general funding instruments, and this is going to be a huge limitation. So even from the perspective of industry, if we look to PPPs, a PPP program, it should be something, in fact, effective, clear, comprehensive, covering the entire point, the all points of financing, IP, technology, regulations. So a partner that wants to invest in fusion needs to have a clear environment, and the PPP program can be an instrument, of course, but it must be clear, pragmatic, and focused, specific to fusion. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Moving now from the question to the audience. The first one maybe is for you, Esther. Germany is already pushing forward and globally competitive in fusion energy. What is the role for a larger European strategy rather than focusing on specific member states?
Yeah, I think we have touched upon this perhaps earlier, that it's about harmonization, but also allowing the flexibility of individual member states. So whether it's a code of practice, a code of conduct, that we also work out together with the regulators, that could be, because that could be the goal here, because as we discussed earlier, there's already a tremendous supply chain, and this is the competitive advantage of Europe. Other countries such as the US and even China are just trying to work this out and establish their own supply chains. So the supply chain is all across Europe. The businesses rely on them. So it is very important that there is a harmonized set of rules by which licensing is done, by which certain elements of demonstration and scale up is done. So this is not over-centralization of rules, because you have to allow for the flexibilities and the specificities of each member state to do what they want in their regulatory context, but also kind of harmonize them. And I think the European Commission has done that previously in other sectors. So there is evidence on how to do that. We would be, from our part, very happy to work with the regulators to work on this code of conduct, to work on the right approaches.
Thanks a lot. Second question is related to the UK, who has announced increased investment into fusion to support STEP and industry development. How will that affect Europe, maybe the supply chain, and how can the fusion industry maximize benefit despite ongoing friction and uncertainty after Brexit? To whoever wants to take that question.
I'm going to comment on that because answering is complicated. It's a complex question. In general, whatever funding to fusion is really welcome, because we all want fusion to succeed and to become a reality. The British program in supporting STEP is making a big push in pushing for technology, pushing for finding solutions, and organizing a supply chain. I think that this is a good thing, and Europe and US and whoever else can benefit at the end of the day. And how this can have an impact into Europe is something that needs to be defined, because in the same way that we have an agreement in Europe, and I say we because I'm European, we have an agreement with Japan within the border approach. We don't have an agreement with UK for fusion. How is this agreement good or bad? How this agreement should be handled is something that the European Commission will need to decide. And it's something where, again, I think the private sector should have a voice to express their opinions and understand the strategic collaboration, how we can go faster and cheaper by making this collaboration it makes sense to push for fusion. There are a number of elements which are transversal. Everyone is interested in pushing for, so this is easy to identify and agree. And there are other elements that are related to your IP and your competitive advantage that maybe you don't want to share, maybe you don't want to put into agreement. So understanding which of the elements will help you without damaging you for sharing too much is a complex exercise. The private sector should be involved in this analysis, and based on that, countries should establish agreements. But it's something to keep in mind, which are the kind of alliance that we want to have to go faster. I don't know if someone wants to add something more, but
I will take silence as everyone approve with you, Sheila. Unfortunately, we're already at the end of the time that was allocated for this webinar. I would encourage everyone that attended to not hesitate in the future to just reach out to continue the discussion from doing it offline too, to discuss further the recommendation and the different measures that are needed for the fusion energy industry in Europe. As a key high-level takeaway, I think it's quite clear that there are a lot of opportunity in the fusion energy and the industry in Europe in terms of like both sustainability and European competitiveness. It is also quite clear that we do have the tools to make it accessible. So what we really need is kind of a new comprehensive strategy and clear political change and tools that we hope will be coming by the end of the year. Thanks again for everyone for attending this webinar, and I hope we will be able to continue this discussion in the future. Have a nice afternoon.